Three, two, one, we are live. And I deliberately delayed by a minute in order to build up the suspense around this very exciting broadcast. This is the second in what we hope is an unending series of Who, What, Why coming to you, not just anymore in print, but also via video. We are very excited to be communicating with you in this means. We know that a lot of folks are busy or they don't like to read old-fashioned text anymore, so we're going to try communicating this way. We do want you still, of course, to visit the Who, What, Why site. That's where the main act is going on. Anyway, here we go. We're talking tonight about the JFK records release that took place yesterday. If you were tuned in, you know that we were waiting all day long for those documents to drop. It had been 25 years since the JFK Records Act had passed unanimously in the House of Representatives, mandated that all withheld records about John F. Kennedy's death be released by government agencies. And they had 25 years, and there it was, the day, the final day of the deadline, and we sat there all day long, hour after hour, nothing. The website of the National Archives kept saying, stay tuned, and stay tuned, and stay tuned. And at 5:45 p.m. yesterday, the White House had a call with the press on background, and they explained that, in fact, they were about to release the documents, but not all the documents, because a bunch of agencies said, hey, whoa, wait a minute, don't release all the documents yet. Can we look at them? Can we look at them? Because maybe that endangers American national security, that documents that are 54 years old may just reveal something that's going to put us all in mortal danger. And so Donald Trump, outsider, critic of the CIA and the FBI and all of these agencies, agreed. And he said, got to be careful here, folks. So we're going to give them some more time. Why it is that these agencies, with all this time already, had not looked and expressed themselves, and why there had to be that delay remains to be seen. Will be interesting to see if there's any kind of outrage by the public, although I think if there had been, it would have already come, and it would have had to have been stoked by the mainstream media. That was their opportunity to express disappointment at such a colossal failure. But anyway, we have a document release. We have some documents out, and we're going to talk about those tonight. We welcome you to submit your questions, and we encourage you to please share this. Tell your friends. I don't know how you do it. I'm sure you all know how to do it. Go on here somewhere and share this. It's probably a button that says share. So please do share it. We'd love to have a large audience here. About 1,000, 1,200 people watched our first cast last night. That one was not well publicized, or publicized really at all. This one only a little bit more, and we'd like to see how many folks are going to join us or watch it later on. I'm going to slow down my speech because my mother tells me that I talk too fast, and you know, we got lots of time here. So we're going to slow it down a little bit also because people are just beginning to join us. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk about what we know so far about the records release. And I want to get into this gradually because I know that as more people join us, we're going to get the questions that I had already answered. They're going to say, why did you talk about the records release? How come you got into this other material? And in fact, we would have already talked about it, and they just were late. So here we go. Basically, some of the news reports made it seem as if the White House had released all of these documents. In fact, the White House released very few documents. The White House released just a fraction, about 10% of all those withheld documents. And what they did is those documents are broken down into two parts. There are the documents that were previously withheld in full. That means they never released a part of them. Some of those were released last night. And the second group are ones that were previously released in part. And what that means is that they redacted them. They take basically the equivalent of a black marker and they blot out whatever they don't want you to see, and then they release the document. Some of them, they only block out a few words. Some of them, kind of amazing to see, they'll give you a sheet of paper and literally every single word, every character on the entire page is blocked out. So they released, they were supposed to release, we thought, around 30,000 documents in full, and instead they released 30,000 documents. Now, what they released were there were 3,100 that had previously been withheld in full. As far as we know, they released, are you ready, 52 documents. And of course, we've had a chance to go through them. All the news organizations have had a chance to go through them. And then there's this much larger body of documents that were previously released in part. Those are the ones that were redacted. This time they were supposed to release those in full. Now this gets very, very tricky, because if they mix these together or you don't know what's what, you don't realize which ones had already been released in full before and which ones had been released in part before. And even if you know they were released in part before, you don't know what it was that they blacked out. And what we're really looking for is, what did they black out before that now is being made public? And so at Who What Why, what we've done is we put together a team under our Who What Why staffer, Jimmy Falls, a team of a whole bunch of great folks who are very methodically going through the documents and looking at them and sorting them. And then those go on to another group of people, JFK assassination experts, very knowledgeable, very thoughtful people who are looking at them, trying to figure out what they mean. This is going to take some time, folks. I want to be clear about that. It's going to take some time. The traditional media loses interest quickly. You saw, for example, the Washington Post had a dozen people who went through really quickly last night, and they took their shot and they're pretty much done. They wrote kind of a light piece. They started with the most sensational. When I say sensational, I don't mean important ones. I mean the ones that were a little bit salacious or a little bit titillating or intriguing for some reason. And it was only the last document, the last one on their list, that struck me as being important and extremely interesting. And we will talk about that as we go forward. So I'm just going to pause for a second here, and I'm going to take a look at some notes being provided to me by my trusty assistant, Claire. Let's see what we've got here. This is going to be how we'll handle whatever of the questions that we can't handle. Mila says, I find compelling the theory that Manuel, our team, was holding the umbrella seen in the Zapruder film, signaling E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, an unknown third assassin, when to fire fatal shots. What say you? Do you believe that Louis Stephen Witt was the umbrella man? Well, I'm going to say that that particular subject falls under the somewhat arcane. I will talk about it briefly, but I am going to guess that most people don't know what this is about. I'm going to encourage you to go to whowhatwhy.org. You can search in the search box on the site for Umbrella Man, and you can read a couple of articles that I wrote on that. But in short, what happened was just at the moment that Kennedy's limousine was passing by the grassy knoll and that Meridian Strip on the other side, a man standing there began pumping an umbrella, and this was on a bright sunny day. He began pumping an umbrella. As he was pumping the umbrella, the shots rained down on the car and hit Kennedy. Now, that would seem to, I think, any reasonable-minded person something highly suspicious and worth investigating. And yet the mainstream media has either not focused on that at all, or they tried to poo-poo it. The New York Times, in a particularly disgraceful act, brought in the documentarian Errol Morris, and he interviewed a Kennedy researcher who poo-pooed the whole thing, and who came up with this story that the man was signaling that he felt that John F. Kennedy was guilty of appeasement of the communists, and he was signaling by reminding people of Neville Chamberlain, the British chancellor who had a prime minister rather who had appeased Hitler. And Chamberlain carried an umbrella with him often. It was maybe sort of his trademark, and that this was somehow supposed to communicate to Kennedy in a very subtle way that he disapproved. Well, that just sounds so ridiculous on its face, but there's the New York Times getting behind that. And so the real story of the Umbrella Man is probably never going to come out. A man did surface in the 1970s, a man named Witt, and he came forward and he said, oh, that was me, and this is why I did it, and so forth. I personally don't believe that it was him, and I do believe that this was part of this elaborately choreographed coup/assassination, that he played some key role, whether it was as a distraction, whether he was signaling, because he was exactly lined up with the umbrella to help calibrate long-range shooters. And I think it's a very interesting thing that ought to be investigated more. So thank you very much for that question. As to whether the shooters were Hunt or these other people, that's a whole other question that I'm not prepared to get into right now. Let's see if we've got some other questions here. Or what I can do is I can go to some other thoughts. So one of our researchers, Bill Simpich, who is an expert on the Kennedy assassination, made some interesting points to us in some internal emails. And he basically says that the media knew that there was supposed to be this much larger number of documents released. They did not get into it. Kudos to Rachel Maddow, who did point that out. She was virtually alone, I believe, in the major media in pointing that out. Again, the fact that these agencies come at the last hour and say, please don't release it, we'd like to have some time to look at these, when they had 25 years to look at them. This is outrageous. There's some question as to whether this is illegal or not, given what the law required, that all documents be released in full on that date. There was supposed to be only for extenuating circumstances if there was some sort of an emergency, but that's not an emergency. That's just these outfits not doing their job when they were supposed to do it. And of course, all this gets into the question of what's really going on here. We've had some notes from some of our team who are speculating about a war between Donald Trump and the so-called deep state. The idea is that Trump doesn't get along well with these agencies, which I'm sure is true, but also behind all that is this issue that they're investigating him for his Russian connections. And it is entirely possible that by his playing ball, at least in part with them, and saying, yeah, I'll give you more time to make a case for holding back these documents, that he may be trying to sort of game them a bit and basically hold over their heads the idea that if you go after me too hard, I may not do what you want, and I may go ahead and release documents that are highly embarrassing to your agencies. So there may be some very interesting sort of house of cards, back alley machinations going on here. By the way, it's 7:15 Eastern time now. We're going to go till 7:30. We may go longer. Yesterday we went for an hour because more and more people kept coming on, and we started getting more and more questions from the audience, and so we're able to do that. I do see a note from a Carol who says, I hope this is viewable later. I'm in a loud restaurant. It's too hard to hear. Okay, well, we'll see if we can accommodate you. We know how important it is to have dinner, and I hope to have dinner one day. Okay, let's see. So I see some more questions here. Chris asks, did you see the document that talks about the FBI went to interview a witness that had gone under hypnosis before he was interviewed by the FBI? Chris, I cannot say that I did see that. That sounds interesting to me, and I'm just going to flag that for Jimmy, if you're watching or when you watch this, to look for that document. That does sound interesting to me. The whole issue of hypnosis is very interesting because the CIA had a program called the MK Ultra. It was made public in the 1970s by Frank Church's investigative committee. Since the early 50s under Allen Dulles, they had experimented with all forms of mind control, from using psychotropic drugs like LSD, trying to use hypnosis, and trying to see if you could create a Manchurian candidate, people who could basically be programmed and would do things against their will. So we're very interested in anything that deals with hypnosis. And of course, hypnosis usually is represented in the kind of benign context of being a tool that law enforcement uses to help people try to remember things. But there's a lot of other issues with hypnosis. One, I think, important thing to understand the context of this document release and the historic importance of it is that the Warren Commission, the official body to investigate this, concluded that it was Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone, that there was nothing more to it. And then in the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded essentially the opposite. It concluded that there was a probable conspiracy based on the evidence. That's something I think most Americans probably don't know. And again, the news media never tells you that. That's just a basic fact they ought to announce right at the start of any program about the Kennedy assassination. And you'll see these kind of talk shows and these reporters sitting around chuckling about these conspiracy theorists and sort of laughing about people with tinfoil hats. Hey, did you know that the House of Representatives committee concluded a probable conspiracy? And would you say that to your viewers, and would you then go ahead and try to ridicule people who are taking this seriously? I think it's important to note that many very prominent people believed that there was some sort of an organized effort to remove the President of the United States, and that included, as far as we can tell, everyone from Harry Truman to Richard Nixon. Bill Clinton showed an interest in this subject, as did many other occupants of the White House, and their top staff showed a lot of interest in this. Podesta, et cetera, all showed a great deal of interest, both Democrats and Republicans. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower issued his warning about the military-industrial complex not that long before John F. Kennedy was assassinated, several years before, in Ike's valedictory address. He basically was an astonishing statement. I don't think ever in American history has a president been so bold as to threaten power centers by making that offering that kind of a critique as the old general did at that moment. And of course, there's the question about Oswald and who was Oswald. I've been doing a number of interviews today with radio stations, and they've been asking me what I was looking for in the documents. Well, one thing that I'm looking for is some kind of acknowledgement that the government knew who Lee Oswald was and were interested in him. Now, let's keep this in mind. Lee Oswald was in the armed forces. He worked on super sensitive things at Atsugi Air Base outside Tokyo. He worked on the U-2 spy plane program. While he was in Russia, the U-2 was shot down by the Russians, which destroyed Eisenhower's attempts to create some sort of a rapprochement with his counterpart in Moscow. Very significant event. Oswald claimed that he was defecting, that he was a believer in socialism. And then he changed his mind and he came back to the United States, but he never renounced those views, came back with a Russian wife. This is at the height of the Cold War. What is the chance that Lee Oswald would not have been of interest to the FBI, to the CIA, to the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Army Intelligence, Marine Intelligence, all of these outfits, Air Force Intelligence, that he would not have been of interest to all of them, and presumably also to the Secret Service. And what we find is that this man returned and he was embraced by the national security apparatus. A man named George de Mohrenschildt, and if you want to read more about him, I refer you to my book, Family of Secrets. I have a whole chapter on him. George de Mohrenschildt, a Russian emigre living in Dallas who was conservative and part of the establishment, connected to all kinds of people, including George H.W. Bush, an old friend of his. He took Oswald under his wing, and he later explained that he did that because the head of the CIA's domestic contacts office in Dallas, with whom he played, I believe it was handball or racquetball, got together with him and said, this guy, Lee Oswald's returning from the Soviet Union. Would you keep an eye on him? Well, he not only kept an eye on him, but he basically became kind of like his manager or his mentor. And he and his wife, the de Mohrenschilds, began squiring the Oswalds around, introducing them to all kinds of remarkable individuals, like an Admiral Bruton, an admiral from the Navy, like major oil people, all sorts of interesting figures. This a man who had renounced the United States and was believed to be a communist and perhaps a communist agent and at the height of the Cold War. And so they're going to tell us that there are no government files on this man, that nobody was interested in him. That on its face is so preposterous that we know that there are documents being withheld. All right, let's go to some more questions. Let's see, Donna, thoughts on supposed confession of Carlos Marcello or Marcello, depending on what you prefer, witnessed by an FBI informant, ? Outlined in the book Legacy of Secrecy and featured a few years ago in a Discovery Channel documentary. House Committee on Assassinations thought Marcello would have had motive and opportunity. Look, there were a lot of people who had a beef with John F. Kennedy. Having a beef with John F. Kennedy is not the same as conspiring to kill him, and it's not the same as having the ability to kill him, and it's certainly not the same as being able to orchestrate this sort of astounding cover-up at the highest levels of the U.S. government that we have seen to the present day. So was Carlos Marcello involved? I mean, he may have been. There are indications, certainly, that there were connections. Lee Oswald himself and his family had ties back to Marcello. Marcello had ties to David Ferry, an intelligence operative who sort of coached Lee Oswald when he was a teenager. You can read a lot of this in my book, Family of Secrets. It's also, there's a picture of Lee Oswald with David Ferry when Lee Oswald was in the paramilitary Civil Air Patrol, an entity that was used to recruit young men for future use in the military or in the intelligence services. Was he involved? I mean, I think he was. I have to say that I find a lot of these books and the fact that they get on the Discovery Channel indications that they are favored by the establishment. The establishment will not permit someone like me or the kind of people I work with in general to come on. You will not see us invited onto the major network shows. You won't even see us invited onto what you think are these very gutsy, liberal, progressive, or conservative shows that are supposedly outside the mainstream. I haven't been on Fox News. I haven't been on MSNBC to talk about any of this, despite years of research that I've done, nor have other people who have this kind of knowledge. So the people who get on there on your Discovery Channel documentaries, to me, that's what is called in CIA parlance a limited hangout. A limited hangout is, let's call it a partial explanation, which is tantalizing, but which really distracts people from the real explanation or the full explanation. And so, yes, I think it's important to look at Marcello, but I don't think that he's the main deal here. We have some more questions here. I'm going to try to get to them as quickly as I can. And by the way, this is entirely uncensored. I haven't been doing any research in preparation for answering these questions. They just came in the last few minutes, and nobody's feeding me answers. So I'm just looking at them, reading them out loud, and I'm totally winging it. So doing the best I can. All right. I wanted to just bring up a few other points about the release and the significance of some of these elements. Of course, the background on this is Oliver Stone, who has been reviled and ridiculed over the years. I have a great deal of respect for Oliver Stone because he took tremendous risks with his career as a major Hollywood director and made this JFK film. He's told me that his career really suffered as a result of it, but it was a very interesting film, and it made people think. It led to the 1992 act that created the Assassination Records Review Board and that mandated the release that began yesterday. So hat tip to Oliver Stone, I think an American hero. I want to mention that Who What Why is painstakingly analyzing these documents. It's going to take us a while. We'll start providing our analysis on the site ASAP. I think you'll probably see the beginnings of commentary and analysis as early as tonight, but certainly by tomorrow and over the weekend, and then we will continue to put out whatever analysis we can provide over the course of the coming weeks and months. I want to encourage everyone to please sign up for our mailing lists. There's a box on the website where you can do it. And if you support this sort of work, to consider making a tax-deductible donation to our organization, which is a nonprofit. Your funding makes it possible for us to do the kind of work that we're doing on this. All right, some more questions. And I see it's almost 7:30. I guess the question is, should we stop soon or should we keep going? So we're going to sort of take a vote of whoever's here now. And why don't you put your comments up about whether you're enjoying it. Is this useful at all? Is this interesting? Have I put you to sleep? Am I still talking too fast, Mom? Do you need a stiff drink? Do you hate my sweater? You know, whatever you want to talk about, I'm good. By the way, do go back and watch yesterday's show because I was wearing a really nice collared blue shirt. Okay, let's go to some more questions. All righty. We've got John says the mainstream media are all referring to Oswald's trip to the foreign embassies without raising the issue that the, quote, Oswald at these locations may have been an imposter. The photographs that do exist are obviously not Oswald, and don't we have FBI memos that state that the audio tapes made were not the real Oswald and were probably destroyed? An imposter Oswald at the embassies means conspiracy. Bingo, John. Well put, well put. Exactly right. We don't know that Lee Harvey Oswald was ever in Mexico City. We don't know that he went to or contacted the Mexican or Cuban embassies. All of that is in real doubt. And it is correct that the surveillance cameras that the Americans had installed showed a man going in representing himself as Oswald, who was a burly man of a different shape and height. His hair looked different, his face looked different, a different age, everything different about him. That was the supposed Oswald that they caught on camera. Also, the voices on the phone did not match. The FBI said something wrong with this, and I'm not going to go into it here because it's rather complicated, but it appears that the CIA was later scrambling to obscure the fact that it either was involved in this operation to put this fake Oswald in there, that it had these cameras there at all, that it was cooperating with the Mexican Federal Security Service, that there was something going on here. And of course, the CIA is deeply compartmentalized, so there are indications. We're not absolutely sure what Wynn Scott, the head of the station, knew, what other people there knew, people in the station who may have been directly involved with the Kennedy assassination plot, whether they were doing something unauthorized in order to implicate Oswald or to create this legend that Lee Oswald was getting ready. This is the story that seemed to be put out, that Lee Oswald in the months before the assassination was creating an escape trail for himself to Cuba and then to the former Soviet Union. And of course, if somebody had left the United States and gone to those places, they would have said, oh, this is the man who was in the Texas School Book Depository. To me, all of this are indications of foreknowledge and of planning. What else do we have here? Okay. Let's see. Rachel, are we, Claire, are we going to be getting, am I going to be seeing I guess just the questions, right? So I guess I'll just read what I'm seeing here, people who are tuning in. Steve says, keep going. Holly says, keep going with an exclamation mark. Russell, that's not me and no relation, says, keep going. Ed says, keep going. Tom says, tuned in late. By all means, keep going. But if you do stop, can you do a quick summary before you sign off? Oh my God, how could I summarize this? Maybe you all can summarize it. Maybe I can turn the camera on you, or maybe one of you would like to be the recording secretary and would like to write a tight summation. Wouldn't it be interesting if one of you was able to do that, a really tight summation that I could read? That would be fun. That would be really cool. Participatory democracy here. So let's think about that. And if worse comes to worse, I can try, but I can't guarantee it because my voice is going hoarse. I've been blabbing all day. I've been up since very, very early. I was up late last night working on this stuff. So I do what I can. What a martyr. Okay. Let's see. Some more questions from Claire. Okay, we've got Frank, does the word patsy ring a bell? Yeah, I heard that somewhere. When I heard, oh, I know, Lee Oswald. At least the only time we know there was the real Lee Oswald was when he was at the Dallas police station, and he went before the cameras and he said, rather calmly, which was kind of weird, he said, I'm a patsy. Now, nobody ever figured out, all those people who say Lee Harvey Oswald did it, ever figured out why he did it. Nobody could explain. None of the so-called lone nutters have ever provided a credible explanation of why Oswald would have wanted to kill Kennedy. And usually, at least when you commit a crime, they say he wanted to become famous. Well, usually if you want to become famous, you commit a crime, now you're on camera, what do? You say, I did it, I'm proud that I did it because I want to be a historic figure, I did it because I hated this person, I did it because I hate my parents, or I was paid to do, whatever it is, you say something. And Lee Oswald said, I didn't do it, I'm a patsy. So doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe somebody has an explanation of why that would still prove that he did do it, but I don't know what that is. Brad says, I'd like to hear your thoughts on JFK Jr. and his untimely demise. Was his plane shot down to stop him from entering politics and exposing the truth about his father's murder? Well, I don't know. And one of the things I try to do, and one of the reasons I started Who or Why, is we desperately need agnostic investigation of everything. Is it possible that was an accident? Obviously. Is it possible that was not an accident? Yes, it is. Is it more likely it was an accident? I mean, statistically, yes. But when you consider who it was, when you consider what family he was from, when you consider what befell his relatives, when you consider that he was thinking about a run for public office, and not to name drop, but I did know him. I worked for John F. Kennedy Jr. Doing a major piece for his magazine George, and I found him to be gutsy. He allowed me to go to Germany and spend a lot of their money and do a major investigation of the Church of Scientology for his magazine. And this was when most of the other media wouldn't touch that subject. They were just terrified of this outfit and its sort of hooligan practices toward those who criticize or investigate it. But he let me do it and backed me up. I thought he was a stand-up guy. From what I understand, he felt there was more to the assassination of his father than the official story. But they had to play it very carefully. I think when you're from one of those families, the advice is always don't go public, don't talk about this, because people are going to try to pick you as a nut or somebody with an agenda. Let others do it. So I do think we have to look carefully at that. I know that there was a rush to put out statements explaining what happened and why the plane went down. I find all of these rushes to judgment improper, A, and B, suspect. It's too soon to make those statements. You probably know that Who, What, Why was the only news organization, I'm going to say, in the world, serious professional news organization, that raised questions about the rush to judgment about the Boston Marathon bombing. We saw a number of anomalies that happened that first week, stories that kept changing, things that didn't make sense. And we saw, frankly, we saw a lot of weird coincidences related to, believe it or not, the Kennedy assassination. Now, the Boston Marathon bombing happened 50 years after the Kennedy assassination in Boston, of course, from where the Kennedys hailed. The same day there was a Boston Marathon bombing, there was a mysterious fire at the John F. Kennedy Library. Was this ever investigated by the media? No. The Tsarnaev brothers had no history of any kind of violence or being prone to any kind of radical activity. They had CIA connections. Their uncle was married to the daughter of a powerful former CIA official. Some of their professors had ties into the special forces, CIA, and other entities. These were all the kinds of things that we found and we reported on at Who, What, Why. Total silence out there. People were scared to report on it. A few shows, one local Boston PBS affiliate had us on there, but you'll notice you never hear about this stuff, not even on the PBS, NPR, Democracy Now!, all these shows, you don't hear them talking about these things. I don't mean to pick on them, but the fact is they're not quite as gutsy as people would like to believe, and I understand why. Because there is a machine that destroys people, and it starts whispering campaigns, and it makes you out to be a kook, and you're marginalized, and all your opportunities start disappearing. Life becomes hard. You may have trouble making a living. You may have trouble supporting your family, sending your kids to college. There are real consequences for digging deep into these kinds of things. I hope I get some brownie points for being candid here. It's not going to serve my interest, but I guess I don't need a job in the mainstream media anymore. Where are we? Let's see. Okay. More people joining us, and good to have you. Keep sending those thumbs up and the hearts and baskets of food, please, and jugs of whiskey. All will be most welcome. By the way, please don't actually send me jugs of whiskey. I can get it. Lots of Irish bars right here in my neighborhood. Okay. Excuse me. Let's go back and look at some of my notes about things I should talk about. So other things we got to look for Army intelligence files. Are there Army intelligence files being released? Because there hasn't been much. Been less of the kind of thing we would expect to see from Army intelligence. If you want to know more about Army intelligence, there's all kinds of interesting books that get into the activities of Army intelligence in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. Since I'm shamelessly plugging my book, Family of Secrets, there's some material in there on that. Army intelligence behaved very oddly, and there were some high-ranking Army intelligence people in the motorcade. One of them, who was not supposed to be in the motorcade, basically shoved his way into the pilot car. We also had a supposedly off-duty Army intelligence person who for some reason happened to take pictures of the 6th floor at the time that the shooting took place. How he happened to be lucky enough to do that, that's very, very interesting. So we think there's a lot more to know about Army intelligence, and we'd love to see the files. Some more questions. Holly says, can you address the medical evidence that shows JFK was killed by 2 shots from the front, cited by Doug Horne? You know, I can't. And the reason I can't is it's kind of a bottomless pit. There's so much contention on that issue. You will be able to read some of it on our website. Millicent Craner, who's expert in the medical evidence, has been writing a bit about that. I'm going to leave that to her. I am working on a book. I don't know if I mentioned that, a new book about the Kennedy assassination. Been working on it for about 10 years. Hopefully finish it in the next couple. I want it to be as definitive and authoritative as Family of Secrets was, more so. And my goal is to try to establish everything that can be firmly established about what happened to John F. Kennedy and why. That's my goal. And what I do with the medical stuff, I think I'm going to have some of it in there, but I'm going to be very, very careful. So I don't want to have anything in there that people could say, well, there are other arguments on this. There's so much good stuff that really can't be contested. For example, the sheriff's deputies, the first to get to the 6th floor, they didn't find a Mannlicher Carcano. They didn't, and they found another gun, and that's very, very important. How did that happen? Where did the narrative go from being why am I blanking out here? Somebody help me out. What was the other gun called? Was it a German gun? I'm not a gun fan, so I'm blanking out on that. But anyway, it was not a Mannlicher or Carcano, and I know that one of you is going to be here in a second with the answer to that. In fact, let's see, Mauser, Scott. Hey, Scott, thank you. Mauser. There we go. All righty, back to the questions. John says, Peter Dale Scott, love Peter Dale Scott. Hi, Peter. Good friend. Love to sit in his backyard in the Bay Area and drink a glass of wine and eat some crackers and vegan cuisine and talk about all kinds of things, look at his poetry and hear his profound insights into deep state studies. I would urge you to read Peter Dale Scott if you haven't. And also you can get a start by going to whowhatwhy.org and typing his name in, Peter Dale Scott, and you'll get a little bit of a primer on him and links to his books. Peter Dale Scott has identified a technique of compromising sister intelligence organizations, setting them up via some embarrassing failure buried in paper trail that eventually enlists or prompts their complicity in a cover-up. Do you think so? I love that, John. Please send me an email. I'd love to be in contact with you and talk to you about it. And by the way, folks, I welcome research help on my book, and Who What Why welcomes people who have the skills and the diligence to do the JFK records release work. We're always glad to hear from you. We'd like to get a resume and a cover letter explaining why you would be qualified. And while we appreciate that everybody's interested in this, just being interested is not enough of a qualification to meet our needs. You've got to have either some kind of a forensic background, have worked with documents, have extensive knowledge in this area, something like that. Anyway, John, love to hear from you. And yes, you're absolutely right. I do believe that a key component of any kind of successful intelligence operation is to identify all of those people and entities that might cause you a problem and then compromise them. And because we know that the CIA has always been, for example, in competition with, back then and to the present day, the FBI, we know that it would be very difficult for them to get full cooperation from that other agency. And so if they happen to have compromising information, or they in some way were able to, let's say, entrap the other agency, create some problems for them, they would count on an instant cover-up. And I think what we saw with the Kennedy assassination was that the primary sponsors identified all kinds of people and entities, and they were able to shut them up. And if you listen to our broadcast of last night, I talked about how I believe they compromised Robert Kennedy himself. And I think this was absolutely brilliant. I think the FBI, some people in the FBI may have been involved, but I think in general, they compromised them, and the FBI had to go into shutdown mode. And that's why we saw the FBI controlling the investigation, putting out a leak right away stating that it was Oswald, that there was no conspiracy, and basically forcing the hand of the Warren Commission so that the Warren Commission could only repeat essentially what Hoover had put out in the first hours. Steve, what can we do if there's concrete proof that the government was involved? It seems they're doing whatever they want. Great question, Steve. One thing I think it's important to understand is when you say the government was involved, I'm not a real fan of like bashing government per se, because as a kid, I went to a very cool elementary school and we got a chance to create our own government, and it was really cool because we got, say, 20 kids together. We elected an administrator or a governor. We elected a representative. When a bell would ring, the representative would run to another location and meet the representatives of the other groups. They'd talk. They'd come up with some kind of an agreement. Government and democracy, even representative democracy of the form that we have, which is not absolute democracy, are pretty cool. at least in theory, if you've got intelligent, uncorruptible people looking out for the public interest. You may be laughing, but I think there are people in government like that. I think a lot of people who work in the federal government are basically exactly like us. There are bad people, there are good people. I think generally the federal government hires pretty high quality people. That's been my experience. And so I think that we don't want to just go after government per se, but I do think that there are elements within the government that there were and there continue to be whose mindset or whose job is to protect a perceived national interest which aligns closely with what Bernie Sanders called the 1%. It aligns closely with the mindset and the objectives of this sort of deep state, this kind of elite, industrialists, bankers, people who are in resource extraction around the world, manufacturing, telecommunications, the big players. And you see them getting together, places like the Bohemian Grove, they all get nude and sing silly songs. And it's all a process of stripping them all down, literally and figuratively, so that they are kind of brought to an elemental level and then made to bond. All of these things, the Bilderberg gatherings, all these things are to create that kind of class cohesion. So I think that what you're looking at is a part of government, some of them in government, some of them formally in government, some of them people who are in a way more powerful than government, people able to influence people in government to do what they want. So what can we do, Steve asks, if there's proof that the government was involved? And it does seem like they're doing whatever they want. I think we have to talk about this. There are people who have believed for decades now that we need to rethink many aspects of our government, from the way that elections are handled. Decisions like the Citizens United decision are very, very damaging, and they destroy democracy. The Koch brothers, I think, are personally responsible for destroying democracy. Say the Mercers funded Trump in a big way. I think they're all complicit in the destruction of democracy. I don't think they like democracy. I don't think they want it. So I think we need to reduce their influence in government. I also think we need to have much more accountability. We need to look at these agencies. There have been proposals. Kennedy hinted at doing this, which was to basically shut down the CIA and create a whole new apparatus. Harry Truman, who signed the 1947 National Security Act that created all this intelligence and modern military and intelligence apparatus, he himself said that he basically had been sort of misled as to what that was going to be. He didn't ever want an agency that he did what he called something like fun and games, or playing games of the sort that they did. He meant what he was talking about, covert operations. He never expected the U.S. to be actively going in and meddling and bribing people and fomenting coups and killing people. I mean, it got totally out of hand. And I think we need to look at getting rid of these agencies, reconstituting them. And then we have to have regulatory entities that have real power. The intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, totally neutered, compromised, infiltrated, and simply unable, blackmailed, all of this, simply unable to do their jobs. So I think we got to rethink all of that. We really have a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we could do it if there was interest, if there was a public demand for this. Frankly, as far as I know, there is no organization and no movement to reform or transform or destroy and reinvent this apparatus for something better in the public interest. Okay, let me pause for a second and see where we are and what we're doing. It is now 7:50 Eastern Time, 6:50 Central Time, 5:50 Mountain Time, and 4:50 Pacific Time, and we do not discriminate, nor to those of you who may be coming to us from other places. But I think what we're going to do is probably wrap up in 10 minutes, probably all exhausted, try to sum up, and then we can continue again another evening if folks would like to do that. Let me just look and see if we can take a few more questions. Wes asks, do you think we'll ever get a deathbed confession from Poppy Bush? His speech at Gerald Ford's funeral, where he chuckled over the line, deluded gunman, seemed almost like he was bragging. Well, some of you may know my book, Family of Secrets, is all about the Bush family. I spent a lot of time investigating George H.W. Bush and his bizarre claim not to remember where he was the day that Kennedy was shot, or at the time Kennedy was shot. I investigated that for years. I found out where he was. It's all in the book, won't go into it now. But I don't think we'll get a deathbed confession from him. I think he understands that it's not good and it's not in his family's interest. Although I do think, and if you want to know more about this, please go to yesterday's program, which is up on Facebook. You can hear me talk more about that. Edward says, what about the deaf mute who saw people leaving the grassy knoll by car and on foot after stashing a rifle in an electrical box nearby? Just be clear, it was not the deaf mute who stashed the rifle, who saw them. I believe that was Ed Hoffman. Yes, he saw all kinds of interesting and important stuff. Not going to go into that here. I do hope to go into that in detail in my forthcoming book. If you want to know more about it, you can read about that. I think Hoffman was very credible, and I think that was very important information that should have been acted upon. A question from, I guess, Michael Castellini, our Who What Why Facebook chief. He says, when they allude to the danger of harming foreign relations, do you think they mean any other country besides Cuba or Russia? That is a great question. These have all been great questions, actually. They're withholding all these documents. They say it threatens our national security and could harm our foreign relations. Yeah, duh. I mean, my God, if it comes out that the U.S. Kills its own presidents, of course it's going to harm our foreign relations, because people are going to say, we don't trust you. We don't want to deal with you. Yeah, but hey, you know what? Let the chips fall where they may. Let's all be big boys and big girls. I talked more on yesterday's video cast about how all these other countries are willing to own up to the bad things that they did. We ought to be willing to do that as well. And so, yeah, I think it's all countries who will harm the relations. And of course, Cuba, can you imagine what kind of a cause they would have to push back against the United States? And of course, Putin, absolutely he would, absolutely. Chris asks, do you think the CIA is trying to protect Papa Bush by resisting disclosure? That's a great question. You know, Poppy Bush, is held in a special place in the hearts of certain people at the CIA. Very interesting that he was only CIA director for a year, yet much shorter than other people, yet they named the headquarters after him. That's very interesting. Why do that? What did he do for the CIA that was so important? I don't think the media ever even bothered to ask that. That's how terrible most of this media, including your favorite big New York newspapers and magazines, how terrible they are that they never even think about these things, let alone talk about them. And so I think it's entirely possible that they are trying to protect him, that there are little bits, these so-called breadcrumbs that we're looking for to connect the dots that could be in the withheld documents. I think they have a problem. These are probably younger people going through them. They probably don't know what to look for, and they're never told explicitly to cover up. They're just told, signal anything you see of interest, and then it goes up to somebody else who reads it, and then somebody else who reads it, and somewhere there's somebody who knows what these things mean. For all I know, they end up going to Poppy Bush, and he reads them, and then he makes the final decision. I mean, we just don't know. All right, 7:54. A few more things here, and then we're going to start moving toward wrap-up. Going to drink some water. Drink your water. Important to hydrate. You got that, Claire? Important to hydrate. Next time I'll tell you what toothpaste you should be using for proper dental hygiene. I'm a font of useless and occasionally useful information. Okay, let's see. Steve, George H.W. Bush, please describe his role. Yeah, I'm going to hold off. That was in yesterday's segment. Family of Secrets is full of all that stuff. So it's not like I'm trying to make you shell out for it, but you probably can find excerpts, bits and pieces here and there. But you know what? We all have to pay our rent. So shell out a few bucks for it, read it. A lot of stuff in there, chapters and chapters and chapters on Scott says, are you expecting Noam Chomsky to weigh in and correct everyone on how there was no conspiracy, or has he quietly learned his lesson? Well, I like Noam Chomsky, and we sent him my book when it came out, and he wrote back and he said something like, very interesting. And Howard Zinn said something to that effect. Both of these men, I think, real correctly legendary and important figures, both declined to get into this thing or stated that there was no conspiracy. I think each had their own reasons. I think part of it has to do with Noam's perspective on power. And I think a lot of the so-called lefties are not interested in any things that go into these kinds of covert operations or conspiracy by these, cabals or cells or elites, because their entire analysis is that it is the class structure of the society that causes the problems. And if you're focusing on these particular kinds of outside or semi-unique acts, I personally don't think it's inconsistent with some kind of an analysis of how society is structured. I think they're consonant with each other, but I think they feel that it's problematical. Maybe we can do another show, talk about this. I'm hoping if the audience grows enough on this, and by the way, tell your friends, and did I say tell your friends, we can grow this audience, make it worthwhile. We've got to have thousands of people watching this to be worth our while to do this. We can talk about all these things. Maybe I can get Noam Chomsky on. We can have a conversation about that. Maybe I'll just get him on the phone. I'll surprise him. But yeah, we can talk about that stuff. But I think another issue is that it was very hard for Noam and Howard to even find a perch. They were rarely featured on television or on major radio stations. And they just found their little outcropping to perch themselves on and to do their thing. And I think that they felt that if they were to, and I'm not saying, by the way, they may just literally believe the Warren Commission, but I think that they felt that if they were to also take on this other huge and risky burden, it would simply be too much, and it would be damaging to their cause, which is to focus on the important issues. Noam, many different things, including the uses of the language, of course, and Howard Zinn very much on an alternative version of our history. Okay, I think we are going to wrap up here real quickly. I see Steve asked, why name your magazine George? I think JFK Jr., they wanted to call it something else, and then somebody either tried to stop them or somebody else had a similar name, and they ended up naming it for George Washington. At least that was the story that came out, the father of the country, implying politics, suggesting covering democracy and American history and so forth. Okay, so appreciation to Robert in Los Angeles, who's been guiding me in terms of how the technology works and the kinds of things you ought to do to be a good hostie. Not hostie, the FBI agent and the Oswald thing, but a host. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here, for joining us. This is a group effort. You're all terrific. We couldn't do any of this without you. With the emails you send, with the documents you find, your tips, your ideas, your questions, the way that you help us amplify our message. We need everyone, every single one of you. Yeah, you, yep, and you. Oh, and you. To ask everyone you know to please follow, and you to personally do this at least. Please follow the Who, What, Why Facebook page to get updated on upcoming live streams on the JFK assassination and many other equally scintillating and riveting topics. Also, if you got some spare change, please go online and support our work. We don't accept any corporate money. We don't accept any advertisements. We don't even take advertisements from outfits we like. No advertisements. It's all funded by you. And that is how we're able to bring you this unfiltered, uncensored information. I don't know, Robert, anything else I ought to be saying here as we start wrapping up? You could send me a message, or Claire could send me a message. I don't know if they're supposed to do something else here. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. There's also a Russ Baker Facebook page. More importantly, there's also Russ Baker Twitter. It's at Real Russ Baker. There's a Who What Why Twitter. You should definitely be on that one. The Russ Baker one is a little bit more me letting down whatever hair I still have left and being a little more jocular, a little more irreverent under my own banner where the organization doesn't have to answer for it. Okay, I'm not hearing that I ought to be doing anything else, so I'm going to thank everyone. Go get your dinner, enjoy yourselves, hug your families, hug your country, and let's all work for a better country. And let's do this another time. Stay tuned on Facebook, and we'll figure out what comes next. Thanks, everybody, and good night.